Welcome to chapter 13. We're in the respiratory system. You only have, after this system, you have the digestive system, the urinary system, and the reproductive system left. So there's only 3 systems after this chapter. That's crazy. So good job on working hard this semester already. So let's get into the respiratory system. So when we talk about the respiratory system, we're going to look at the structures that make up the respiratory system, both their physical form and their functional form. So we start with the nasal cavity. The nose is this region here. We have 2 nostrils. They're separated by a nasal septum. Then air comes into the nasal cavity, it flows around, it gets warmed up and starts to be humidified. It flows down the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the larynopharynx, and eventually goes in through the larynx. The larynx is also known as your voice box. There's a little flap here called the epiglottis that's going to close whenever we swallow food to help keep food and water or food and drink out of that larynx. The larynx leads into the trachea. The trachea is also known as the windpipe, and it has cartilage rings surrounding it on 3 of the 4 sides, not on the posterior aspect. The trachea, the C-shaped cartilage, helps to keep the trachea open so that air can flow into the bronchi. The bronchi then branch off into multiple smaller and smaller bronchi and bronchioles. Then these are going to lead into the lungs, so the bronchi lead into the lungs, but the bronchioles then lead into smaller and smaller tubes that eventually lead to respiratory bronchioles and then to the alveoli where gas exchange occurs. This structure here is the diaphragm. That's the major muscle of inspiration. So we can look at the respiratory system as an upper and a lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract includes from the nasal cavity all the way to the larynx. The lower respiratory tract then moves from the trachea all the way to the alveoli. The major function of the respiratory system is to bring in oxygen so that we can produce energy. So gas exchange occurs between the blood and the external environment at the alveoli of the lungs. And the passageways leading to the alveoli function to purify air, to humidify air, and to warm the air. So let's look at each structure individually and learn about their functions. So I put this picture here. I know it has no words on it, but you can all see that this is the nasal region. There's the nose, nasal, or nostril, I should say. And this structure here is the nasal cavity. So the nostrils are the route for air to move into the nasal cavity. There is a nasal septum composed of the vomer bone and the ethmoid bone that form that nasal septum. And air moves to the back of the nasal cavity and then eventually goes into the pharynx. There are olfactory receptors at the superior aspect of the nasal cavity. These rest in a region of mucosa. And so as air comes in, the air gets moistened and it traps foreign particles. The mucus itself and the enzymes in the mucus help to break down any bacteria. But as the air comes in, any olfactory sensations, so any odorant molecules, that's what I want to say, that move into that mucus can actually be picked up by the olfactory receptors, and then we can actually detect a smell from those. So there are, within that nasal cavity, we have concha, which are projections from the walls of the nasal cavity. These increase surface area and increase turbulence. So as air flows, it hits those bumps and it kind of starts moving around. This helps us to trap more pathogens potentially, as well as helps the air to warm up. There's a palate that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. The anterior aspect is a hard palate, and that's composed of the maxilla bone and the palatine bone. Then posterior is a soft palate. And so here you can see the hard palate composed of that, like I said, maxilla bone, and then at the back we have the palatine bone. And then we have a soft palate that hangs back here. The very end of that soft palate is the uvula. The uvula is important in the digestive system because it moves up when we swallow to keep food items and drink items from going into the nasal cavity. Here we have the concha that I was talking about. And then in between are nasal meatises that help to, they're like little tubes within the nasal cavity that help to increase surface area and to help air start moving faster. The nasal cavity has paranasal sinuses associated with them. There are a total of 6, 2 frontal, 2 sphenoidal, yes, 6 paranasal sinuses. Oh my gosh, I can't count, can I? There are a total of 8 paranasal sinuses. Wow. So we have 2 frontal, 2 sphenoidal, 2 ethmoidal, and 2 maxillary sinuses. These function in lightening the skull. They act as resonance chambers for speech, and they help in production of mucus. And so here you can see a frontal sinus and you can see a sphenoidal sinus. The next region is called the pharynx. The pharynx is broken up into 3 main regions. So we have a nasopharynx, we have an oropharynx, and we have a laryngopharynx. The pharynx actually is a passageway. That's all it is. It's also known as your throat. It's a passageway for fluids and for foods as well as for air. And so we share the pharynx in 2 different organ systems, the respiratory and the digestive system. The oral and laryngopharynx serve as a common passageway for air and food, like I said. The epiglottis, which is the top of that larynx, is what keeps food from entering the anterior larynx. Instead, it shuts as food is swallowed, and the food goes posteriorly down the esophagus. Then we have a pharyngotympanic tube that opens directly into the nasopharynx, helping to drain the middle ear and also reducing pressure or releasing pressure. There are tonsils located within the pharynx, and some of these tonsils are located very close to the nasopharynx. So we have a pharyngeal tonsil. It's located within that nasopharynx. We have 2 palatine tonsils located in the oropharynx. And then we have 2 lingual tonsils that are located at the base of the tongue. The tonsils that we typically think of when we think of having our tonsils removed are the palatine tonsils. But oftentimes when the palatine tonsils are removed, we also remove this pharyngeal tonsil. And so here's that pharyngeal tonsil way up here. Here is the palatine tonsil, and then you can see the lingual tonsil right here. So when you have your tonsils removed, it's usually the palatine tonsils and the adenoids that are removed. So at this point, you should be able to tell me what the organs of the respiratory system are. What organs are found in the upper respiratory tract and what organs are found in the lower respiratory tract? What is the major function of the nose? What are the there are 4 sets of paranasal sinuses. Name them basically. What is the function of the paranasal sinuses? List the 3 portions of the pharynx. What is the pharyngotympanic tube? Which you should know from our nervous system chapter, special senses. And list the different tonsils and explain the functions of the tonsils. I'm going to stop here and we will get into the next video in a few minutes. Bye.